I am Chris Norby. I'm on the Board of Supervisors of the County of Orange, so if you're bored, I'm here to supervise you. And if you're not, well, that's even better, because this is an exciting topic, one which combines lifestyle choices and however we choose to live our lives. The important thing is that we have free choice in a number of options. Redevelopment agencies, as they function in California, centralize the idea that government top-down planning can revitalize cities and revitalize neighborhoods. Now, it's fine to revitalize, but when the process of revitalization is never ending, and in fact you're revitalizing something that was killed by government action in the first place, then you really wonder if this in fact is that or something else. Redevelopment agencies, and I'm going to walk you through this booklet, The Unknown Government. It is unknown because redevelopment agencies are created in California at a citywide level. About 90% of the 450 cities we have in California have created them. And they became a kind of unknown government, operated by cities, but they're really not part of the city. Theoretically, they are levels of state government which the cities activate. Their budgets are virtually off the books, although they now consume about 10% of all property taxes in the state. And they have powers that no other level of government has, especially the power to take your property and give it to somebody else in the name of urban redevelopment. A little bit about the structure of the organization. On the inside cover, you see our statewide coalition. We've been in existence for about the last dozen years. And the group here in San Jose is particularly active, and we've met here on a number of occasions in San Jose. In fact, this t-shirt that I have was produced by the Castle Coalition out of Washington, D.C., which is a kind of a national organization, eminent domain, and distributed here locally. And if any of you want one of these free ones, they're located there on the back. Hands off my home, hands off my business. The booklet proceeds on three different tracks. If you like turgid prose, very, very concise. I started with prose about 3 times this size, and I got it down to about a third. And that's what good writing is. You start with something big and you really whittle it down. It's sort of the opposite of a term paper, where the kids try to write as much as they can with saying very little, because they figure that the professor weighs it rather than reads it. If you don't like that, then there are a lot of great graphs in here, a lot of great charts for the wonks. And if you don't like graphs, understand them, then they're the cartoons. And they pretty much say it all. And here on page 3, you see this man popping out of a cake. I am the redevelopment agency, and I am here to help. Now, in order here on page 5 to create a redevelopment agency, you have to have blight in your city. But the problem is blight can be defined in just about any way that you want. And some of the most wealthy cities in California have found blight. Blight traditionally means areas in the inner city that are deteriorating in tenements and things like that. But in fact, it's found in raw land, and it's found in a lot of other areas as well. And even those areas traditionally in inner cities or that have been called slums, blight is widely misunderstood. Jane Jacobs, those of you that are familiar with that, says that the areas that planners determined were blighted back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, subject to urban renewal, were in fact incubators of small businesses, small immigrant families, whether they were from Sicily or sharecroppers from Alabama. And that when these white Protestants from the suburbs came in, the progressives, and saw kids playing in the street stickball, or they saw them playing with fire hydrants, or women having their laundry on the balconies above, or men smoking cigarettes and drinking a 6-pack on the front stoop, to them that was horrible. And that these were blighted places that had to be revived, when in fact there were neighborhoods there. There were relationships, and when you simply wiped all this out and put these people in tombstone-like housing projects, you condemn them to slums far worse than what they came from, and slums at great, great public expense. And so this idea that from the top down, government can not only cure blight, but can define what it is in the first place, is a very dangerous one, and is one that has repeatedly failed throughout the country. But if they find the blight, and it's easy to find it because all you have to do is hire a consultant and he'll go and find the blight for you. then suddenly the agency can create this tax increment district, and whether they're called TIFs, tax increment financing, or economic revitalization zones, or in California where they're called redevelopment areas, all the extra property tax revenue generated from that point on, most of it from inflation, having nothing to do with the redevelopment agency activity, then goes only to the agency. Apologists of the agency say, well, we don't increase your taxes, which is true. Redevelopment agencies cannot increase taxes. What they do is like tapeworms, they leech on to the taxes of other entities. Now, some of those other entities, whether they're school districts or whether they're cities or counties, might not be using your taxes in the best way possible, but at least they're using them for some type of public purpose, education or libraries, rather than taking them and lining the pockets of NFL team owners or big box store owners or things like this. Bonded debt, here on page 5, can be incurred without a vote of the people. Vast business subsidies can be given. And also, perhaps the most dangerous, the power of eminent domain can be used not for a public use, but for a so-called public purpose, which is any purpose that the agency wants to define. So blight makes right, and the finding of blight gives suddenly these vast powers. It's sort of like if you went to the doctor, any of us could go to the doctor, let alone a psychiatrist, and they'd find something wrong with us, and suddenly they now have a blank check to run our lives. The tax increment diversion, as you see on page 6, is now about 12% of all property taxes in the state are simply off the books. And these are going mostly to subsidize commercial development. Redevelopment agencies in California, unlike some states that don't have sales tax, they like Oregon, are driven by sales tax because it's the part of the tax which goes directly into the general fund of a city. So cities will do whatever they can to attract sales tax generators. Usually they're simply stealing the customers from one nearby city and bringing them to their own city. They're not really generating anything new. But this is the motivation behind a lot of redevelopment agencies. In California, the net losers and the natural enemies of these agencies are the counties, because the counties, providing public health services, providing other general welfare services or library services, probation, counties run the court system, counties run sheriff's departments, are those that are hit the most. And it shows here that about $5.5 billion in diversions from county general funds have been diverted. Now, I was on the Fullerton City Council for 18 years. Cities generally are proponents of redevelopment agencies because they want the Costcos and they want the NFL teams and they want all these good things that redevelopment supposedly will attract. When I first got on the Fullerton City Council, I was a critic of redevelopment and felt that it really couldn't work. And my colleagues on the council said, look, we're bringing in this price club, and look, we're doing all these great things with this redevelopment agency. But then after about 5 or 6 years, what happened is the nearby cities were using redevelopment subsidies to steal our businesses away. We lost 5 dealerships to Buena Park. Buena Park simply came in and lured the dealerships away with cash subsidies and free land, much of it acquired by eminent domain, along the freeway. Buena Park said, don't blame us because Cerritos was stealing our dealerships. And so soon we were having to offer public money and additional written down land to existing auto dealerships, not to attract new ones in the sales tax, but simply to keep the ones we had. It was sort of a redevelopment shakedown, and my colleagues were now saying, well, Chris, you're right. Boy, all these cities are using it against us, but unless we use it, we're going to lose our tax base. But now that I'm with the county, and am chairman of the Orange County Board of Supervisors, Orange County, which you talk about, gee, the city versus the suburbs. I don't know how a lot of you can tell the difference, or if the new urbanists can, because suburbs now are job centers. You take a place like Irvine, which has twice as many people working there as live there. Is that a city or is that a suburb? You look at the housing patterns and they're suburban, but the job concentrations are definitely urban. I think during the Silicon Valley boom, and maybe even now, more people were driving out of San Francisco to work than were driving in. So this line between suburb and urban, is increasingly blurred. Page 9 shows that redevelopment agencies, far from curing blight, are simply finding more and more and more of it. And in fact, about 30% of all urbanized land now in California has been officially declared blighted. Now, you'd think if they had gone in, cured the blight, and many of these agencies have existed since the 1950s, they would be shutting down. We cured the blight, it's now over. Sort of like when you go to the psychologist, you go to the marriage counselor, and he finally says, hey, your marriage is in great shape, you don't need me anymore. But of course, there's always more going on, and since these are money creation machines, more and more agencies are created consuming more and more land. The debt now on page 10 is about $81 billion in public indebtedness. Even if agency activities were shut down today, this $81 billion is money which would continue to have to be taken out in property taxes. This is money which would not go for libraries, not go for public protection, public health, or public education, but only to pay off the indebtedness of the redevelopment agencies throughout the state. And it shows here on page 12 the growth in this indebtedness. It also shows where these agencies are. Now you'd think, well, if they're really helping repair all these blighted areas, even if they really are blighted, you'd think most of these would be older cities. But it shows here on page 13 that, well, you got Oakland, you got San Jose, which is now second in terms of redevelopment indebtedness, but Fontana, most of you probably don't even know where that is. La Quinta, that's out there where Bob Hope used to play golf out by Palm Springs. Palm Desert, I mean, these are, relatively affluent suburban retirement communities. Victorville, Fairfield has more redevelopment indebtedness than the entire city of Los Angeles. And so much of this has really nothing to do with actual blight or actual urban need or the need for money to cure social problems. And if you look at page 13, the per capita indebtedness, you have cities like Industry and Vernon in Southern California that don't even allow any people to live there. They're sort of like, isn't Colma like that up here where you only have dead people and you don't really have real people living there because they don't allow any housing, yet they're using this whole thing as a kind of a scam to subsidize more commercial development. Corporate welfare is at the heart of this, page 14 and 15. The idea that government, through public money, should pick winners and losers in the economy and shower money on who they think the winners should be at the expense of the losers. Now, the good thing about attacking corporate welfare is you've got those on the right that just hate welfare, and those on the left that just hate corporations. So you can bring conservatives and liberals together. Corporations, yeah, liberals hate them. Welfare, conservatives hate those. And so you have a coalition of people, sort of the anti-Walmart crowd that doesn't like Walmart because of health benefits and things like that, and say, look, we don't like Walmart. I don't care about Walmart from a free market standpoint, but Walmart should not get over $1 billion, as they have, in public land write-downs and subsidies, simply because cities think Walmart is bringing in jobs and sales tax revenue. Now, if Walmart can compete against mom and pop, against True Value, against the unionized grocery stores, fine. But the fact is that redevelopment agencies give the big boxes money, just as they do the NFL team owners and the auto dealers, because they think it's going to bring in more sales tax revenue, when all it does is simply redistribute it and lead to sales tax bidding wars in certain areas. The problem politically, on the other hand, is there are Democrats and liberals that just love welfare, even if they're giving it to rich people, and the Republicans that say, hey, we like corporations, and gee, I'm pro-business, let's give them more money. But the fact is that when you give money to any business, you distort the marketplace, and you distort the ability of the marketplace to adjust, and you also destroy the ability of small businesses to compete. All large businesses, no matter how large they were, started in a storefront somewhere, started with somebody's idea, and we have to allow that process to continue. And the idea that local government can subsidize shopping centers or subsidize auto dealers or subsidize arenas, and somehow that's going to generate more money in the private market, simply doesn't exist. And if you read the booklet, there are story, failure after failure after failure of where these projects simply are not economically viable. Go to the corner of Hollywood and Highland, the mall there, which is about a third of the value that it was about 10 years ago when all this money, tens of millions of dollars in public subsidies went into there. And all we really now have to show for it is the Kodak Theater. The Kodak Theater, which really has only one significant production every year, and that is the Academy Awards production. The Academy Awards Oscar presentation is there at the Kodak Theater. Now, did the Kodak Theater need this publicly subsidized auditorium for one of the wealthiest businesses in the country? Where were they having the Academy Awards program before? They were having it in the Shrine Auditorium. The Shrine Auditorium held about 3 times as many people. It was paid off by the Shriners back in the 1920s without a dime of public subsidy. And when they moved it to the Kodak Theater, half the people that used to go couldn't go. And they also had a contract. It's a funny thing that when the MC for the Oscar presentation, he can say anything he wants. He can use 4-letter words, criticize the president, criticize your sexual orientation, whatever it is, promote his or hers, doesn't matter. But there's one thing they cannot mention. They cannot joke about it. It's actually right in their contract. They cannot mention that the Kodak Theater is in a shopping mall. and that shopping mall was built to try to revitalize downtown Hollywood, which it utterly failed to do at great public cost. Perhaps the worst offenders are the NFL teams, the Major League Baseball and football teams and basketball teams. The NFL really is nothing more than a shakedown operation. You talk about a business which has no business value at all, but is nothing more than a shakedown operation. The second largest market in the country has not had an NFL team in the last 15 years. That's Los Angeles. When a team moves from the LA area to St. Louis, I mean, who goes from LA to St. Louis? You know, they're not being motivated by actual market conditions, but by how much money they can shake down. And book after book, one written by Roger Knoll, economist here at Stanford, says that these sports franchises are losers for any community. They generate absolutely nothing for the community. Yes, people go to the games. Yes, they spend money on popcorn, but if they weren't doing that, they'd be going to bowling alleys or miniature golf or doing other things. They're not net generation in terms of the community, but simply ego builders for the local politicians. Sales tax shell game, 16 and 17. Cities will talk about jobs, they'll talk about retail, sales tax receipts, but really all they're doing is pirating those of their neighbors. And the problem in California local government is that local city revenue, which is so sales tax dependent, because that 1% of gross sales goes directly into the city coffers, that cities will promote activities which will generate them revenue, which really have nothing to do with jobs. In fact, industry which produces jobs in communities doesn't produce any sales tax revenue at all. What produces sales tax revenues are big boxes and those that are mostly selling things from abroad. And this is true in many states as well. Not all, but many. I was in New York City, about New Rochelle, the suburb of New Rochelle, and there was a guy there, Jerry Newmark, and there was a small industrial park. He employed about 24 American workers making drill bits. I didn't know we still made drill bits in the United States, but he was making them there in New Rochelle, exporting them all over the world. And he said, the city of New Rochelle is using eminent domain to take my factory, displace all my workers, and replace it with an IKEA superstore. So they're going to throw American workers out of their jobs, replace American companies with a big Swedish conglomerate that's going to sell all this cheap stuff made in China and all these other, Bangladesh and all these other places, simply because the sales tax was going to be going to the city. So part of this demands reform of local government revenue. So we're not simply rewarding consumption and chasing consumption all over a region, but are rewarding, in fact, real job and real wealth creation. If you see the chart here on page 18, this is a survey taken of city leaders throughout the United States. Not the United States, but California specifically, city managers. The type of activity they wanted in their cities. And the number one thing they wanted was retail. The one thing they did not want was heavy industry. Cities don't want industry because it doesn't produce the revenue that they need. Retail does. And so if we could restructure that revenue thing, we could restructure the rewards that redevelopment is creating. Page 19 shows sales tax per capita. Sales tax per capita is an important factor in these agencies. Theoretically, redevelopment should, if it's working well, is rewarding older, poorer cities by getting them a chunk of their wealth back so they can deal with extreme social problems. But if you look at per capita sales tax that's being returned to these cities, mostly it is the wealthy cities, it is the suburban cities, and the older cities that are being left out. If you look at the money here in the fold-out, page 21, it shows where the money is going, mostly for debt, administration, property acquisitions, and very little of it for other things. The myth of economic development, page 22 and 23. Economic development comes when people use their ideas, their freedom to invest their money and other money in ideas that they have. It doesn't come by the government choosing from the top down winners and losers, whether it's in industry or in retail. And the idea of redevelopment is economic development. Wow, we're going to have this great economic development. You see this all over the country. You know, there's a little strip center, there's some little stores here. Let's tear it all down, and we'll have this huge mega center with all these chains. Now, I've got nothing against chains, Starbucks or Birkenstocks or Nordstrom's or these others. But the fact is we need nondescript strip centers. We need nondescript areas where you've got a little taqueria or a little nail place or a guy selling model airplanes. We don't need all these centers to be exactly the same, because this is what incubates businesses. And this is what makes our cities interesting. A city without blight is a place I really wouldn't want to live. Some of the most interesting cities and neighborhoods are somewhere you don't know if they're going up and you don't know if they're going down. but you know that there's some activity there, and it's exciting. If you look at the actual record of these agencies in terms of creating wealth on page 24 and 25, you see that the cities that have these agencies are no better off. And if we continue, housing is something that, like most cities, they simply don't want. And this is part of our housing issue here. It isn't just that cities want expensive housing to keep property values high. Many cities really don't want housing at all, because in California, the property taxes don't support the services that homeowners need. And that's why virtually all new housing in the state is built behind guarded gates on private streets, where people through mellow roofs or through individual assessments have to pay for all these improvements that those of you and I who live on public streets pay for out of our taxes. And that's why if more of the property taxes could be kept by cities to pay for these public improvements, cities would welcome housing and not just commercial. And that's one of the problems with housing developments in California, is that when you are a home builder, it's not just restrictive zoning or all these other things, it's all the fees that you have to pay because the city doesn't think that the future taxpayers are going to pay that. Now, some people blame that on Prop 13, that we don't pay high enough property taxes in the first place. It just doesn't have to do with Prop 13, it has to do with the way that the property taxes are dispersed. The fact that virtually all of it goes to public education, very little of it goes locally, so the local cities have to fight over sales tax and chase each other over customers and try to fight each other over their auto dealers. Now, eminent domain is perhaps at the crux of this, here on page 28 and 29. The idea that cities, local government agencies can use eminent domain to take your property and then sell it to somebody else at a discount or virtually give it to them. And the thing about eminent domain is it's not just immoral to use it for such a purpose, a non-public purpose, but it doesn't make any economic sense either. Remember, the heart of morality isn't some detached idea of right and wrong. It has to do with the effects of it. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You don't do unto others just because it's good, because if you do good to them, it'll come back. The Hindus call it karma. And if you look at project after project which was built on the basis of eminent domain abuse, not only were they a failure morally by forcing people out of their long-time homes and businesses who had a stake in those communities, but the developments which replaced them oftentimes were failures as well. And we can point to example after example, whether it's downtown Pittsburgh, whether it's the Triangle Center in Costa Mesa, which Costa Mesa used eminent domain to displace these small business owners. Higher and best use, we can determine that. What determines highest and best use? It's ultimately the marketplace, not planners. And so they condemn these businesses. We're putting in a Nike town, we're putting in a food court, all the stuff that goes into redevelopment project, and now the place is about 90% empty. Go to the corner of Hollywood and Highland. As I said, in Hollywood, you'll find the same thing. And that's why when we argue against eminent domain abuse, it's not just because we're benefiting that specific individual, it's because it's good economic planning as well, to respect people's rights. Because if you don't, the slippery slope is steep, and it's extremely slippery. And we also have something to learn from other countries as well. This idea that if we don't have eminent domain, they're going to be this hodgepodge. Go to cities in Japan. And it's interesting how some other countries in the world that we associate with this collectivist, community-minded mindset more than we do here, actually have stronger property rights controls than we do here. In Japan, you can't condemn somebody's property until after they die. The Japanese farmers whose land was condemned for a new airport are still protesting. They're 10 years after Narita Airport opened, when that arguably is a public use. My theory is the reason we have such casual attitudes toward eminent domain in the United States compared to some other countries is that we have so much land that we figure that you're not really, don't have to be tied to any one piece. It's sort of a fungible thing, and if we kick you out of one piece, you'll just get a piece somewhere else. Well, in many countries where land is scarcer, people are attached to that piece of land and they don't want any other piece of land. But the idea of attachment to land goes back a long ways. When the railroad companies went through and used eminent domain to acquire land across the country, they forced out Jesse James' mother from her home in Missouri. And the James brothers went on a life of, well, they called it crime. Some people saw it kind of a Robin Hood thing. They robbed trains, but they only robbed Missouri Pacific trains because their mother got her property taken away by the Missouri Pacific Railroad through the power of eminent domain. The redevelopment establishment, in my mind, is an unholy alliance of bureaucrats and big developers who profit from this. Public-private partnership, they call it. The best forms of public-private partnership are when private organizations with their own private money go in and try to do some public good, and that's fine. Even if it's just for PR, let them do it. But a public-private partnership is not when Al Davis goes to the city of Irwindale when he was kind of dancing around whether or not he was going to stay in LA or go back to Oakland, and gets $700 million just for talking to the city of Irwindale, didn't do a thing, took the money and moved back to Oakland. It's not public money subsidizing private profit. Profit is good, but it's good only because it is made through the voluntary exchange of voluntary free people, not because it is guaranteed or granted by government picking and choosing winners in the name of economic development. My organization is Municipal Officials for Redevelopment Reform. We're a coalition of people across the political spectrum, and we're looking at trying to restore the principles of freedom in California and in local government planning by respecting the rights of all, and also by having a more rational system of local government finance. Thank you for inviting me. You're welcome to take any of these that you want. They're free. I got a whole box of them in the back. Thank you.
We have some questions.
Yes.
You spoke a moment ago about the IKEA
Right.
replacing manufacturing.
Right.
And the propensity to look towards those types of revenue generation enterprises that are actually made somewhere else. And I can't think of any better example of that in my own mind than a casino, where very few of those are located locally. They're all sending money someplace else. What's your experience in dealing with casinos or here in California? I don't know.
Redevelopment money has been used, public money has been used to actually build casinos. The city of Hawaiian Gardens, a small suburb in southeast Los Angeles, is virtually owned by a guy who controls the casinos and who received redevelopment subsidies and eminent domain to acquire land to build his casino. Most casinos in California, of course, owned by Indian tribes, and that's kind of a, are they public, are they private? When the Indians say, look, we're not subject to taxation because we're a government entity, and so we're not subject to that, then you say, well, as a government entity, how can you hire all these lobbyists and contribute money to politicians, because government entities can't do that? Oh, well, we're a private government entity. And of course, there are reasons for this, because we feel guilty that we took all their land, and those that are left, want something for it. Problem is, they start fighting each other and start arguing over who an Indian is, because who's left wants a higher and higher take of it. I'm somewhat mixed on gambling, because as a libertarian at heart, I figure if people want to spend their money and they want to gamble it away, they should have the right to do it. But certainly as an instrument of economic development, it doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't create any wealth. It simply redistributes it from the people who are least able to afford it, because if they were gambling in the first place, they obviously don't have a lot of understanding of the marketplace to those that are better able to get it. So that's a tough one.
We have one more.
Yes.
Yeah. It's in vogue now to attack corporate welfare.
Yes.
The problem is, you can ask 50 different economists what corporate welfare is and get 50 different definitions. So how can you measure it and then hope to eliminate it if you can't define it?
Well, there's hard welfare and there's soft welfare. Hard welfare to me would be the granting of money, cash money, to big boxes, for example. When the Costco went into my city, first they said, look, we just want land. So my city, through the redevelopment agency, spent several $1 million in land and essentially gave it to Costco for almost nothing. To me, that's corporate welfare. Then once they got it, they said, look, we got the land now, we got title to it, and we're going to move across the street to Anaheim because they're going to give us even more, and we're just going to keep this property. We were able to make a deal with Anaheim that if we shared some of the sales tax, they wouldn't do that. And the deal was that if you expand the Costco, we will give you under the table some of your sales tax back in the form of additional write-downs. So to me, there are direct out-of-pocket subsidies that go to corporations that aren't available to all. Mom and pops aren't getting that, and others aren't either. And I have small businesses that come to me and say, look, I'm being driven out of business by these people who are getting my tax dollars to compete against me. Now, there are maybe are more soft welfare. Some say that, look, every homeowner in the country is on welfare because you can write off your interest on your income tax. And you can say that's a form of welfare. I wouldn't go that far. But the cash grants and the use of eminent domain. When the City of Cypress Redevelopment Agency used eminent domain and declared land owned by a church, it actually was just a strawberry field, and a church had bought it to build a sanctuary there. They had the whole plan, the whole thing there, and said, no, this is blight. We're going to take this property, sell it to Costco at half what we pay for it. To me, that is corporate welfare, and the corporations that engage in it shouldn't, because in the end, what it does is it distorts their planning. It makes them make decisions they shouldn't be making based on where the subsidies are, not where the actual market is. Sometimes that's done at a smaller level. We had a lady who wanted a Chinese restaurant. Our redevelopment director thought, what we need in downtown Fullerton is a Chinese restaurant. She came in and we gave her all these subsidies, and the restaurant ultimately went into business. And she said in the end, you know, I got all this money from the redevelopment agency to buy this, get this property, build this building, but there weren't any customers for it. In the end, a business is going to survive based on customers, not based on sucking government money. I hope that answers your question. And I think the subsidies that are being given are very, very blatant. And when it comes to the abuse of eminent domain, it's even worse. When the Archie family in Mississippi, who's owned their land since the end of the Civil War, when they were able to get this, a black family that was able to buy some land at the end of the Civil War, passed it down for 150 years in their family, were facing eminent domain because the Mississippi Economic Development Agency wanted to give their land to Nissan. Now you can say, well, gee, Nissan's going to provide all these jobs, but here the state of Mississippi is taking land from Americans and giving it to the Japanese. Now if Nissan wants the land, they should buy it. You can say, well, it's going to provide all these jobs. What winds up happening is Mississippi versus South Carolina competing for the same factory, and these companies will play one state against each other. And they might wind up locating in Mississippi instead of South Carolina, but Mississippi has given so much away that even though the jobs are there, there's no money to pay for the schools or the roads or the other infrastructure. All businesses should be created equally. And if we're going to give subsidies to businesses, we should give them to all, not one at the expense of another, in my opinion.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you. Appreciate it.